This right here is an old article by about a month. So, not super old, but it is old. But when I saw the question, I said to myself, I've actually asked myself this very same question. Should comic book characters get old? Now, before I even read the article, I did not read it in advance. I will tell you what I think. I think comic book characters should age. I really do. And the reason I say that, there's only so much you can do with a character continually at the same age. Like so many things happen. Like once a comic book goes to that 20, 30, and 40-year point, okay, at some point you've told enough stories that we probably should see this character age. And I'll tell you what else I understand because of the lifespan of some of these comic books. I also understand why reboots are done. Not necessarily reboots where you change the story, but a reboot where you take the character back to the starting point. Because if a character's been going, let's say, for 70 years, okay, you've told a bunch of stories in those 70 years, and you can reboot the series starting at issue number one, starting at the origin story, and not change any of the character's origin, but from that starting point, tell some different stories and give some different angles, things that you didn't see before. But that's just how I see it. But let's get into this article right here because I thought this was interesting. Should comics characters grow old? Fans like me who've been around a while likely remember when TV, comics, and other forms of storytelling were harder to access than they are now. And I can remember, I am old enough to remember when there wasn't a Rob from Comics Explained that you could just go to and find out everything you wanted to know about a specific character within like an hour's time. There wasn't anything like that. You had to physically go read the books or go find some book somebody wrote about the character or just go get a bunch of back issues. That was the only way you were going to find out about this character, other than one of your friends who happened to be a huge fan of a character and could fill you in on all the finer details. I don't think there's ever been a time in comics where you have more access to information and you can know as much as you would like to know about any character. These forms of entertainment were considered more like distractions than full-time commitments. If we missed an episode or an issue, it didn't matter. Every issue was someone's first comic. Was the motto of the day. Yeah, and that's kind of true, because a lot of the comic books that I got into and a lot of the characters that I got into, I didn't read consecutively at the time, right? I was young, I didn't have a lot of money, so I bought comic books whenever I could. And for me, it didn't matter if I wasn't really able to keep up as long as I was able to buy a comic book from some of my favorite characters. So if you hadn't gotten to your local spinner rack before others, well, you missed a story or two. But you could just pick up the following book and wouldn't worry because whatever happened last issue stayed there. Yeah, there was a time where all issues weren't necessarily connected. And not that it never happened, but it was more standalone issues. And I think I like that better. So there was a thing called the status quo. If you wrote a comic story, it had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it was contained in that one issue. Whatever the status quo was, even if you varied it in your story, you had to return to it by the end of that book. And from what I said before, this is exactly why I like standalone stories, because You don't I don't have to follow a string of books and spend $60 to catch up on this issue. Comic books are way more expensive. Now, not that I mind that. I don't necessarily mind, but I do like more standalone issues, especially if it's something that I haven't kept up with. Because if I'm reading and I'm like, oh boy, I don't know anything about this, I'm OCD. I'm going to want to go back and find out everything I could possibly know. But again, the benefit in this time is you don't really have to go buy back issues. So it's not much of an issue now as it once was. In Star Trek, this was called the Galactic Reset Button. Again, you weren't guaranteed to write every story, so you had to return to the place you started so someone else could pick it up and do the same thing next time, and so on and so on and so on. A perfect example of this was a story called Robin Dies at Dawn in Batman number 156. Batman is participating in a scientific experiment, and he is led to believe that he and Robin are on an alien planet, and Robin apparently is killed before his eyes. When he's awoken, he then reacts differently when he perceives Robin is in danger. He jumps immediately and saves him, even when he doesn't really need saving. When the story concludes, Batman realizes it was all a fantasy, so he goes back to normal. Case closed. And you know what? I'll tell you this. Especially so when writers are telling new stories, I understand, you have a series, you have this big story arc you want to introduce. I don't have a problem with that. But I tell you, some of the greatest stories are just the one shots. It's this one book, self-contained, everything you need within this book, and it works. You don't need anything else. That is some of the most exciting reading, but I'm not saying it only has to be that, right? But I don't think that's done enough today. This was done so someone else could tell a different story in issue number 157 the next month. And I think, you know what? I think this probably lends to the fact that sometimes you have people that don't get to finish a story and then someone else will pick up the story but not really do it justice. And then you're kind of left hanging like, yo, this story was going in a direction. And now it just went off the deep end because you have a different writer. And that doesn't always work, especially if you get a writer that really doesn't want to carry the vision of the previous writer. In fact, I remember one time when DC actually printed a page indicating that Batman was always in his early 30s. And this was true no matter how many years had gone by. And this is where I say, I don't think I really mind a character getting old. It's different now. Advertisers want to make sure you never miss an episode or an issue because they want as many opportunities to sell you their product as possible. And that's true. That's true. And that may not necessarily be the best way to approach this from an enjoyment standpoint in comic books. Not that there's anything wrong with long form stories, but we need a balance of long form stories and one shots. Thus, serialization was born. My personal favorite was Star Trek Deep Space Nine. If you missed an episode, you could find yourself somewhat confused as to exactly what was happening. Thus, recording devices became popular. Yes, indeed. As far as comic books went, no more going to pharmacies and looking for spinner racks. Local comic shops with their pull list made it less likely, but not impossible, that you would miss an issue. Character development became all the rage. Consequences for the actions of the previous stories became important. I think this was often best represented by the X-Men comics. In fact, you had better be caught up on every issue from the last 50 years because you might not understand when a character you forgot becomes important to the current story. And this might be to the detriment of understanding modern comic books because again, you get a little lost, but again, also the benefit is you have people like Rob from Comics Explained. So whatever you're missing, if he doesn't have a video, somebody like Comic Drake or there's somebody out there that has a video on whatever issue, whatever team, whatever you want to find out. But this may have been, as this article is saying, an outgrowth of companies wanting you to come back for every issue. The problem that this causes at times, if you get a writer that has not spent the time to learn what happened before, you have stories that contradict previously held truths in this story arc. So that kind of presents a problem. As previously mentioned, the advent of manga to American audiences has started to become an important influence. I understand that the passing of the torch from father to son is quite a common occurrence in manga. At least that's what my friends who are big fans like to point out to me. The Dragon Ball franchise is a prime example of this. Son Goku eventually takes over the main role, and his abilities seem to increase from generation to generation. Of course, anime also is important in this development. I used to watch when Sci-Fi used to run what they call Saturday morning anime movies, so I could watch a glimpse of this kind of storytelling. I still miss that show. Yeah, sequential storytelling. I'm not necessarily adverse to sequential storytelling. See how much longer this article got. All right, I'll keep reading. Naturally, not everything followed these rules all the time. For instance, Dick Grayson started out as a very young Robin before he became the leader of the new Teen Titans, and then he adopted the Nightwing identity. Since then, though he seems to have been stuck at the same age for quite a while now. And that's kind of where you run into that issue of what I say Spider-Man ran into. This is why I think most people in my age group love Ultimate Spider-Man. I grew up with Spider-Man. I saw him as a kid. I saw him as a teen. It's good to see him as a father married with children. I'm older, and it's good to see Spider-Man older. And this is the one area where I say, I will violate my own rule just for this one time, and I would not mind two concurrent books running. Spider-Man and his, tried and true young teenage to early 20s, and Spider-Man the adult with a wife and kids. I wouldn't mind if comic book companies did that, where you have these singular characters. Here's the run with him young, and here's the run with him matured, doing mature people things. I think this is why Bruce Wayne has collected quite the large Bat family. When a new Robin comes around, they don't seem to leave. They just stick around. I still miss Alfred, though. The question is, though, should American comics follow manga when it comes to aging and all? I mean, DC recently replaced Clark Kent with his son, Jonathan, but he just never quite felt real. He never felt like a real Superman by comparison. So Clark is again back in the super suit. I think with Clark, it's a little different because he's Superman. He's an alien. I mean, you could easily say, aliens don't age, problem solved. Does that necessarily solve the issue? Maybe so, maybe not. But again, we read comic books, so to some degree, you suspend reality when you read comic books. This is why I don't mind when certain things happen, because I'm like, it's a comic book. It's not real. like this is why I read this. It's not real. It's enjoyable. Let's see where I'm at. DC. Yeah, I read that one. Super Suit. And DC also tried recently to make a black Batman, but he seems to have faded away. I'm just not sure fans of American comics are ready to see the heroes they have loved and followed for decades get sent out to pasture, at least not yet. I don't think you have to send them out to pasture, but you can have some of these characters age, even if just slightly. Even if just slightly. That doesn't mean you have to change the characters. Like, you don't have to make Batman black. Make Batman slightly older. It's a comic book. We will suspend reality knowing that there's this older guy running around doing the same things he was doing when he was younger. It's a comic book. Marvel had Spider-Girl for a while, which showed her father, Peter Parker, as an old guy who had left the hero business. Also, the son of Reed and Sue Richards hasn't been around as much these days. Do these characters deserve their chance to replace their famous parents? So far, that hasn't worked out well. Okay, so this is my take. You don't have to replace the parents with their children, but you could have, okay, so we had a whole era of Spider-Man in his late teens, early 20s. They could have easily plotted out a story, plotted out, at least the next however many years were okay. Now Spider-Man is going to be in his mid 30s with a wife and kids, and we'll go 20 or 30 years with that before we age him anymore. And then that's why I say then you can do a reboot. Start over, number one, telling the origin story over again. You're going to have new fans. I think that will work. Maybe people disagree. I guess it will all depend on how much more influence manga continues to develop here in America. Granted, conventions like New York Comic Con are seeing the sections promoting American comics shrinking while manga and anime are taking those spaces. But I don't think American audiences are totally ready for manga style storytelling to completely replace our comics. Perhaps time will tell, though. I've kind of said that before. I had a conversation with my youngest son about this. I don't know if manga will replace comic books. Manga has a certain storytelling style, and comic books has a different storytelling style. And I prefer comic books. And I think many people, just like me, prefer comic books. Doesn't mean that manga's bad. Doesn't mean I'll never read it. But comic books is just my entertainment of choice. What do you think? Should American comics be more like manga? Is that the wave of the future with our sales diminishing? Or will there be a resurgence in American comic storytelling? Whatever your opinion, be sure to share it. I think comics are seeing some healthy growth. I made a video about this, I believe, last week. Again, doesn't mean everything's all good. I'm not naive. I'm not gonna tell you it's all good now. We're in the clear. We don't have anything to worry about. I'm not gonna say that, but I do believe comics are, let's say, getting in a more healthy space. And I think there are good stories being told. I think there's a lot of independent comics that are really, reinvigorating the comic book, medium. And I think there are unorthodox books and unorthodox storytelling going on that really wasn't celebrated as much as it is now when I was younger. When I was young, and maybe it's because I wasn't paying attention, it was just superheroes. That was it. Now it's more diverse. It's not just superheroes. You look at things like The Walking Dead and how much success that book has had. Books like Skinbreaker, the success that book is having. There's a Rook Exodus, not really superheroes, futuristic, dystopian future, I guess you would call it. And a lot of these books do very well. So I think in that regard, the American comic book space is transforming and transitioning into something else. But To answer the question that the article posed, I do think I don't have a problem with comic book characters aging. I think you can tell different stories with these characters in some more at a more mature point in their lives.